Excellent. I'm really excited to present today. It's something I spent the last couple of years thinking about and the last year doing, and I'm excited to share some of these ideas with the group. So we're talking about technology cooperatives as an open source business model. And I'll introduce myself a little bit more as we go on, but I was asked to make sure to plug X-Mission. They sponsored this room, and we're grateful for that. It was neat to see P-Dash down in person this morning, and we should all be appreciative of those sponsors. So let's talk a little bit about our goals for this presentation. So herein the presenter shares a world-changing idea. Okay, that might be a little bit pretentious. Let's scale it back just a little bit and say, herein the presenter spreads a meme for effectively administering cooperation. All right, maybe a little erudite, but I think it's a good explanation of what I hope to do. Princeton's WordNet explains a meme is a cultural unit that is passed from one person to another by non-genetic means. It's a fairly net-centric word. But that's the idea. Is I ponder how can we help open source businesses be more sustainable? How can we fund the development of open source software and spread the adoption? And I think I've come up with a good solution along with some other people. I want to share that with you and recruit more to the cause. So our goals today are to introduce a concept, show how it can relate to you as people interested in open source software, and then share practical information about the implementation of that concept. And that part gets a little complex, but it took a while to find some of this information, and so I hope to share it with you, save you some time. So I'm Richard Esplin. I've worn a lot of hats in my short career, mostly working in small companies, developer, system administrator, project manager, and sort of an entrepreneur. Can't say any of my business endeavors have been terribly successful yet, but it's been very entertaining and interesting to work on getting things off the ground. But probably people who know me well, they characterize me as an idealist. I spend a lot of time wondering about how to make the world closer to what I consider a nice world to live in, how to improve society. As part of that, I spend a lot of time thinking about constitutional law. I love reading that kind of thing, and wonder how can we regulate technology so that it becomes something that encourages democracy, creates a freer society, a more egalitarian society, rather than something that restricts and is controlled by few powers. In college, I was introduced to the idea of open source software, and I became a real FLOSS advocate, really the free Libre sort of open source software. That idea of helping use technology to share information, to share cultural ideas, to empower society. That's a neat hack on current intellectual property law that allows a freedom that I definitely appreciate, and I'm grateful to the pioneers who led that way. So for the past year and a half, I've been working on a family-owned business with some relatives, and we do government contracting. And we ended up having a good break between contracts while we were negotiating a follow-on piece of work. And I had 90 days or so that I knew I wouldn't have a full-time gig. So I'm thinking about what should I do at this time. My wife says, you keep talking about this open source cooperative thing. Go out and do it. And so being a consultant with a little time to spare, I decided to go out and do it. Last spring, I threw up a website, printed some business cards, and telling people about my cooperative, Cooperate. So this is our homepage. Cooperate is a technical cooperative for educators. The initial target we chose was charter schools. We pitched the idea March through July of 2009, and we got serious interest from a lot of people. It was really neat, and there were a few organizations that really wanted to help get this off the ground. Unfortunately, launch was delayed. Retroactive budget cuts in Utah education sector really made that challenging. But after 6 months of market testing, I think we really do have. I'm more convinced now than I was a year ago that this is a sustainable open source business model. It just needs a little more groundswell. So one question I'm frequently asked is why educational institutions? Well, it's a nice place to start. It's the low-hanging fruit. There's a robust open source offering in the educational sector. Entire projects like the EdUbuntu project, and there are current school districts like Extremadura in Spain that deploy, Brazil, Romania deploy open source solutions. One thing I realized as I started to work with these schools is there are a lot of local school districts who know and understand open source. Wasatch School District has a Linux technology lab and an open source technology lab, and they try to deploy those solutions into their schools. And there are a couple charter schools in Utah County that have Linux labs and have deployed open source there. And so it was more higher adoption than I expected. Educational institutions is also an area I know pretty well. I'm married to a teacher, and I spent a lot of time, in educational schools, in schools and educational institutions. Another aspect of especially charter schools that's nice for bootstrapping a technology cooperative is that they're fairly small. There are organizations you can bootstrap. They're on par with small and medium businesses. As a lone technology guy, I can sustain one or two of them and get resources to grow. But most of all, helping kids learn has a nice feel-good factor. You go home at the end of the day with warm fuzzies. It's a nice place to work. These charter schools, they face some serious IT problems. Probably the biggest is limited funds, even more than public schools. Most charter schools run really mean, really lean operations. And as a result of that, there's some very limited technical expertise, even among the technical personnel. A lot of these charter schools work purely, all their infrastructure is done on a volunteer basis. And a lot of them don't realize how bad a problem they've gotten themselves into until things stop working, the phones turn off. And then they need somebody to come in crisis mode and solve everything without spending any money. And it gets fairly challenging. They burn out a lot of their volunteers. There's a lot of turnover among technical employees and contractors in the education sector, especially with charter schools. Their core competence is not managing technical personnel. And so most of their technical personnel feel and there's not a real good career path. They're either really happy where they're at, and that's good, or they don't really have anywhere else to go and they move on. That happens quite frequently. And a lot of the contractors are young guys, young ladies right out of school who do it for a little while and decide, that's not what they want to spend their entire lives doing. And each time they try to find a technical person, it's guesswork. It's really hard to figure out who's qualified and who isn't. Now, with these drawbacks, there's great demand for the implementation of technology among educators. Teaching processes such as smart boards, visual aids, games, interactivity are much more pervasive in schools, and they're much more encouraged and demanded by children and parents than they were 10 years ago. There's a lot of student research in schools today, and that demands a robust filtering solution. A lot of schools struggle with that. And teachers really enjoy using technology for testing and grading to eliminate the mundane parts of their jobs and let them do the things humans are really good at, like teaching. And of course, as an organization, they have all the same needs as any other small business. Collaboration software, web, communications, phones, email, calendaring, things like that. So the nice thing about these set of problems and these set of needs is that this is what open source is good at. It's the bread and butter of a small business. Most of these demands aren't really niche. Most of these demands are well served. And so it's the kind of place you can walk in and present a fairly complete offering. So that was the Cooperative model. Rather than being an investor-owned organization, we're a member-owned cooperative. And initially what that means is we're a community. On the website, there's not much there community-wise except for a mailing list at the moment. But we got a couple dozen members, and we chat every so often. And the idea is to help people understand that when you have a question that's related to education technology, there's somebody you can turn to. There's somebody who's dealt with that kind of smart board before. There's somebody who's already figured out what websites are worth going to. There's somebody who's figured out what email systems work best for communicating with parents. So the idea is to build a community that's focused on that niche. A community is nice. It's free for everybody, provides a lot of good information, and it's excellent marketing. Some subset of the people who are involved in our community are going to have a need for services. They're going to need an expert to come in. And by being the facilitators of the community, that gives us a lot of additional credibility to be that provider. We provide services to both members and non-members. Initially, the plan is to provide basic IT services, telephony, email, web, computer support. But the nice thing is that as the cooperative grows and it has more resources, we can allocate resources to anything our members want to solve. Some of the requests we had was with some of these schools, they have one computer class. So they don't want to hire a full-time computer teacher. So could you as a cooperative provide a computer teacher that does 3 or 4 different schools? And the answer is absolutely. Just need to organize it that way and prioritize that. We do custom development, web application hosting, in classroom training, teacher-specific training, anything our members need. Now, the method we chose to charge was to accept revenue in exchange for credits that are redeemable for services. It's a little abstract and it can make it hard, and we might need to change this model because it can make it hard to figure out what will this service cost, what will 1 hour of customer development cost. But the advantage is it makes it really easy for a customer to say, oh, I get a 10% discount if I buy X number of hours of service or spend this much money. It makes it much easier to do budgeting as an organization. So that was one method that we were using to organize that. And it's adopted by a couple other cooperatives we'll look at. We also would provide an end-of-year dividend to members that's a percentage of the money they spend with the cooperative. So lowers their costs. Now for those that are interested in membership, those whose needs warrant make that dividend appealing, they get a couple things along with their membership. It requires an annual fee, which provides the cooperative with the capital they need to provide services through the year. But they get the opportunity to participate in an annual vote. And they get to share in the annual dividend, and they get certain member-only benefits. Currently, that's just bulk purchasing. But over time, we'd expect that to grow. So here, an open source business like Cooperate can better meet the needs of schools than a traditional business or a nonprofit. It can provide cheaper solutions, and it eliminates most of the incentives to provide proprietary solutions. It's in our members' interest to collaborate and cooperate with others in the cooperative and in other organizations in order to have the cheapest possible solutions. So why am I involved? Because I think the idea of an open source business is very empowering. I think that having an open source business as opposed to an open source foundation or group is very empowering. So one of the questions asked is, why does it need to be a business? Businesses are focused on competing effectively. That means providing value for the dollar spent. And when you're providing value for the dollar spent, people feel good about spending money with you. In order to do that, you've got to stay customer focused, or else you die. You've got to do marketing, encourage adoption. You need to reinvest in polish and the ecosystem around the software. That's one of the areas that open source can struggle with at times. You provide careers through sustainable funding to young technical people who want to work in this area but have a hard time figuring out how to get paid. So making it a business that provides revenue to members gives you a long-term plan in a way that's really hard to do with the foundation. And why open source? Most of us understand the answer to that question. But open source improves society. It makes us feel good. We get warm fuzzies at the end of the day. I really like the way Mark Shuttleworth describes it of Canonical when he calls it Ubuntu, or I am who I am because of who we all are. It's South African or an African proverb. Wikipedia has a couple really good quotes on Ubuntu. Desmond Tutu said, "A person with Ubuntu does not feel threatened that others are able and good, for he or she has a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that he or she belongs in a greater whole and is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished." He also said, "We think of ourselves far too frequently as just individuals separated from one another, whereas you are connected and what you do affects the whole world. When you do well, it spreads out. It is for the whole of humanity." There's also a good quote from Nelson Mandela. He says, "A traveler through a country would stop at a village and he didn't have to ask for food or water. Once he stops, the people give him food, they entertain him. That is one aspect of Ubuntu, but it will have various aspects. Ubuntu does not mean that people should not address themselves. The question, therefore, is, are you going to do so in order to enable the community around you to be able to improve?" Now I think those are good explanations of why people engage themselves in open source software and in the free software movement. And the ideal business model needs to meet both of these types of objectives. Needs to, in addition to providing revenue, it needs to benefit developing economies, increase human connectedness, increase individual freedom, protect a free culture, protect democracy, encourage participation. These are the kind of things that open source does very well. And the interesting thing as I was pondering this is that a lot of people outside of the open source community for hundreds of years have been worried about these questions, have wanted to embrace these same values. And so the cooperative model is one answer to these questions. And that's among many open source business models. Now, this is oversimplified, I understand that, but I think it's useful for our discussion. So the first open source business model discussed is the bundle. And we see some companies doing this very effectively. Red Hat's probably the most well-capitalized one. They provide, the code is free, but it's bundled with additional things that are worth paying for: services, support, training. When you have a question that you can't solve, your internal people can't solve, you go to the company that has more Linux kernel commits than anyone else, and that's worth paying for to solve your problem. Software as a service, the Sugar CRM provides. It's worth paying them to maintain the infrastructure that they wrote, because they can probably do it cheaper than you can. That makes sense. They can provide code for free, and there's a business model. Smoothwall Linux does a similar thing. The code might be free, but it's worth paying to get an appliance that's already installed, already configured, and it's worth continuing to pay in order to get a regular compilation of data. That subscription that says, here are sites that are worth having in your enterprise, and here are sites that you want to keep out of your enterprise. Websites for web filtering. That bundle model is very powerful. It has some real positive effects. It generates a lot of open source development. It provides a good investment opportunity. But at the same time, it's kind of niche. It's good for enterprises, but it's not so good at mass adoption. Either it's targeting a specific application domain, or it's expensive enough that people with their own IT staff call on them when they can't solve it internally. But my Aunt Tilly's not calling up Red Hat asking them to help her with their email problems. It doesn't spread down to that level of adoption. Now, the second business model worth discussing is the loss leader business model. We see Oracle really jumping into this with their acquisition of Sun and MySQL. They give away one set of offerings for free. When you get used to Oracle services and you like them as a vendor, hopefully you'll pay for the more expensive proprietary solution. Jumpbox does a similar idea. They bundle open source software, but it's got proprietary, as far as I could tell, installation system that makes it one-click deployments for open source software. You don't have to worry about most of the technical details, but you do have to pay them for that installation service. The loss leader model, it does have some advantages. It does fund additional open source development, but it's really limited because it doesn't fund the kind of development that creates social change and technical freedom. Using the loss leader model, open source will always be second class because the best bits will cost you. So I think there's some drawbacks to that model. Now, the nonprofit open source business model works really well for a certain domain as well. Also, the Apache Foundation, the Mozilla Foundation have done a really good job at funding development, funding standardization, and funding adoption of open source. And they do it through a nonprofit model. Companies invest in the nonprofit, they get a nice tax write-off, and they also get cheaper access to, they get cheaper tools that are funded, the development is funded through the nonprofit. It funds open source, it funds open standard adoption, it funds communication among different industries to create sensible solutions. It does a lot of good in the world. But as a charity requiring donations, it can be hard to make that a long-term revenue stream. And as a charity requiring donations, the end user isn't the customer. Largely, the customer is the people that are willing to invest their money. The larger businesses, the larger users who have an agenda that is often aligned with the end user, but not always. So that lack of alignment can be a limitation. So of these various business models, they all have a difficulty with standard open source adoption. Again, oversimplified but useful. Open source adoption requires exposure. And that marketing is expensive, and it's something that few open source projects are able to do much of. It requires expertise. And unfortunately, evaluating expertise requires expertise. One of the challenges I found as I worked with these schools is that they would take whoever was articulate and think, you're good at your job. Now, articulate, working with a technical person who's articulate is a nice thing. But a lot of these people, though very presentable as individuals, weren't the most qualified technical people and deployed solutions that weren't necessarily in the best interest of the customer. That's one of the challenges. As a non-technical institution, it's hard to tell. Who do you want to work in your, who do you want to hire? Who's the best qualified person? Now, expertise is also expensive. You either have to develop it in-house or you have to buy it. And the current supply in the open source arena is fairly limited. And that makes it hard to identify who can be your vendor. So the third problem with open source adoption is a misalignment of interests. The regular business world is a tug of war between investors, developers, and consumers. Investors want tidy returns, predictable revenue. They want to maximize their return on their investment. That is much easier done with a proprietary and restrictive business model. Developers want something interesting to do. They want to create neato solutions with bad UI and no documentation, and they want the end user to be happy and leave them alone. And unfortunately, a lot of open source projects reflect that. It makes it hard for end users. Now, the consumers, on the other hand, they just want it to work while contributing as little as possible. The less money, time, and effort they have to put in to get their end goal, the better. That's a real tug of war that is hard to put into proper alignment, especially in an open source model. The interesting thing is this has happened before. There are other industries who have gone through this. In the last 300 years, we've seen industries from financial expertise to rural utilities that have had this problem. Groups of people get together and say, nobody wants to serve my interests as a consumer. How can we meet our objectives? And they pool together their resources and they buy the expertise they need. In the financial arena, groups of people get together and say, well, banks are expensive and they don't necessarily meet my needs, but I don't have the expertise to invest my money wisely, so I'll start a credit union. There's 2 local credit unions there. Credit union's a cooperative. You pay for membership and you get to use the resources of the credit union. That $5 down payment or $5 fund you have to have as a minimum balance. Risk management, you see this happen. These are 2 health insurance cooperatives that have done fairly well. Group Health is based in the New York Northeast, and Farmers Health is in the Midwest. And the idea is, how do you handle risk management? We're not experts in managing insurance. We're not experts in risk management. How can we fund an expert that's going to cater to our needs? And that's what the cooperative model is good at. Distribution. The people who's growing the raisins and growing the orange juice, they're not necessarily experts at getting it onto your breakfast table. So they get together and they form some of these well-known brands. They handle the marketing, the branding, the distribution to the retailers and the packaging. And the farmers are liberated from that need. Purchasing. REI is one of my favorite companies to work with. In the 1970s, a group of mountain climbers got together and said, how can we lower our mountaineering equipment's expensive. How can we purchase wholesale? They get together and they form a retail cooperative. The nice thing about REI is about 10 years later, they'd grown big enough they realized, wait, we can fund our own R&D now. We don't just have to purchase off the open market and bulk purchase. We can actually hire our experts and build solutions that meet our needs in ways nobody else is doing. And it's done very well. REI is now the largest consumer cooperative in the world, or at least in the United States, I think in the world. Ace Hardware and Associated Food Stores are 2 local cooperatives we interact with quite a bit that allows them to compete against national chains, even though they're locally owned small businesses. Rural telecoms and rural electrical production is another area where cooperatives have done very well. Small areas that feel like corporations aren't meeting their needs, the capital market isn't meeting their needs, they form together and they hire the expertise they need to lay the wires, to operate the phone systems, and to generate electricity. The National Telecommunications Cooperative Association is the overall group that federates lots of small cooperatives that do this. And Empire Electric is an electric generation cooperative that services the southeastern Utah and neighboring states. Production, this happens a lot. Most production cooperatives are worker-owned. So the Iceberg Group is a technical cooperative. I thought that was really interesting, that they do SAP support. And they didn't want the burden of being pure entrepreneurs. They didn't like managing payroll. They didn't like managing liability insurance. They didn't really want to manage annual taxes as a company for each of their individual companies. So they banded together. It's 12 or 15 of them when I talked to them last. And under the cooperative structure, partners can come and go fairly fluidly. And the cooperative maintains a lot of that infrastructure of the business. Payroll, legal, accounting, that kind of thing. benefits. And as the workers that own the cooperative, they get they get most of that feeling of being an investor or being an entrepreneur without a lot of the headaches that come along with that. And the Design Action Agency is a graphic design cooperative that works with much the same business model as a creative group in Silicon Valley. So the key point here is that cooperatives are about pooling resources and sharing expertise. That's interesting. That's one of the core ideals of the open source development model. Pool resources and share expertise. So let's make this a little more concrete. What is a cooperative? A cooperative is an organization formed to help people collaboratively solve a common problem as equal partners. They share expertise and their resources. They share in the costs and the benefits of ownership. Now let's start in around the 18th century, mostly in Britain and in Europe, during the Industrial Revolution. And workers felt like they weren't being well served and they needed to band together to meet themselves, to meet their needs better. So the cooperative model shares a lot of the same rhetoric over the last 300 years as many other workers' movements. Socialism, communism, anarcho-syndicalism, or whatever you want to call them. But the basic idea is, the big differentiator is that they're attempting to harness market forces to compete effectively. So in the 18th century, a guy named Dr. William King in the 19th century, he saw the need for working people to set up these cooperatives. He saw the value over the past 60 years of the cooperative movement. But he saw that most of these workers didn't understand how to form a cooperative on their own. They didn't see the benefits of striking out on their own. They didn't understand the downsides of what they were currently doing. And so he took the role of instructor, or as I call myself, a catalyst, as an outsider, not wanting to be an owner of the cooperative, but wanting to help those who can benefit see the value of owning a cooperative. Now, this paradox is because those who will benefit from cooperative membership are often unaware of the concept, and they don't have the resources that they're hoping the cooperative will provide. That's the point of the cooperative, to pool resources and hire that expertise. Since they don't have that expertise, they say, we have to go to the open market. They don't see the benefit of banding together to solve these problems. So he started a journal called The Cooperator, and his masthead, I think, is a great summary of what open source largely stands for. Knowledge and union are power. Power directed by knowledge is happiness. Happiness is the end of creation. That was his motto for the time he was trying to start these cooperatives and started a number in Britain. So cooperatives are about shared ownership. There are risks and there are benefits. Part of the cooperative is to spread the risks of capital across the members. So the members of the cooperative, those who are going to benefit from the cooperative, need to be the ones that provide the capital, or they have no investment in seeing the cooperative succeed. Those who are involved in the cooperative are also involved in the governance of the cooperative. The board of directors comes from the members. The executive team is picked by the members. The policies and direction of the cooperative is selected largely by the membership. That can be a problem. It takes time and effort. But it is also one of the great benefits of a cooperative, that you can trust your vendor because you participate in them. You're the investor. And if you don't like the way they're going, you find other members of the cooperative and you change the way the cooperative works. Very directly governed. You also get to participate in the dividends of the cooperative, and you get to receive from the resources of the cooperative. Now, people like Dr. King and other pioneers of the cooperative movement 200 years ago created these 7 principles of a cooperative organization, and most modern cooperatives have adopted these principles. Voluntary and open membership, that you shouldn't discriminate. There should be no 2 classes of members, that everybody involved should be involved equally, and that anyone who can benefit from the resources provided by the cooperative and anyone willing to assume the cost of ownership in the cooperative should be allowed to join, rather than having arbitrary restrictions. Democratic member control. The power of the cooperative, the control of the cooperative should be spread as broadly as possible, while still understanding the need to be competitive and make decisions quickly. Member economic participation. That members should equally share in the costs, but they should also equally share in the dividends that come from participation in the cooperative. Autonomy and independence. Cooperatives are fiercely independent. They make a distinction between the cooperative model and the charity model. As a cooperative, it needs to be self-sustaining, it needs to generate value and bring in revenue, or it shouldn't exist. Most cooperatives don't like government funding. They want to stand independent and rely on their skills and market forces for success. Cooperatives take education, training, and instruction very seriously. They're very open organizations. They think that information should be spread widely, and they work hard to educate the larger community and potential members, as well as their membership, as to the benefits of cooperatives and as to how the cooperative runs and how it's organized. They also invest a lot in their employees, in the workers of the cooperative, for the same reasons. Cooperation among cooperatives is one of the pinnacle foundation principles of a cooperative. Direct democratic participation makes it hard to grow past a certain size. Some cooperatives have gotten pretty large, but most are fairly small. The way that they extend their vision beyond that threshold is by federating multiple cooperatives. So you get a cooperative that's built of cooperatives that provides services to members. And it's neat because it provides, in many ways, the best of all worlds. You get that feeling of a small, closely knit organization that's serving your needs, but you get the benefits of the larger resources across multiple cooperatives as they share among the larger community. And concern for the community. Cooperatives are uniquely positioned because their investors are the community and their membership. They're uniquely positioned to pay attention to the community in ways that an investor-owned business often isn't. Maybe not uniquely, but they're incentivized in a way that investor-owned businesses often aren't. So these principles are very similar to the values that underlie the FLOSS movement. So there are two different ways we can divide cooperatives to look at them in a little more detail. And one is the type of ownership. Now this is where this part is a little more technical, a little more detailed, but it took some time for me to wrap my head around these different models. And I think for those who are interested in forming a cooperative of their own, it's worth understanding some of these things. So a lot of cooperatives are property ownership cooperatives. Housing cooperatives, especially in large cities where it's hard to, where you own just a part of a building, or it's hard to own the building and the land you live on, so you own the building and you get the land from the cooperative. That happens quite frequently. They own real property, and the members are users of the property that's jointly owned. Now, a shared service cooperative is a very similar model, but it's not real property. So the members are resellers of the products or services that are obtained through the cooperative. The cooperative provides the infrastructure that members use to run their own businesses. We'll look at an example of that in a minute. That's largely used in the technical, for technical cooperatives. A producer-owned cooperative is where the producers of a good or service jointly hire the marketers and distributors, and those people are third-party employees. So the people that's working for the cooperative are not the members of the cooperative, they're a third party. But they have expertise that the members of the cooperatives want to tap. A worker-owned cooperative is like we talked about earlier with the Iceberg Group and the Design Collective Agency, that those who work for the cooperative own the cooperative. They are the members, and they can come and go fairly fluidly into the cooperative structure. What I think best fits an open source technical cooperative is the consumer-owned model, where consumers jointly hire producers that work as third parties for the cooperative. I think that provides the optimal alignment between the end user who wants polish, who wants documentation, who wants training, who wants an ecosystem of support, and the developers who want to serve the interests of the end user, provide those fun solutions, and get that third party of the investors out of the way, because the investors are the consumer. Aligns that very well. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an accountant or a tax advisor, but this is how I understand the various legal ways of forming a cooperative. There are traditional business structures, and there's cooperative-specific business structures. And cooperatives can be built, can be formed under any of these patterns, but there's some advantages to the cooperative-specific structures. So a for-profit business, a traditional for-profit business is fairly small, are partnerships, LLCs, or S-corps. And the idea is to provide some legal, some tax freedom, that instead of being taxed as an entity, the tax is passed down to the owners of the business. Now, with these business structures, the downside is that there are a lot of laws that say that they can't grow beyond a certain size, and it's a real pain to switch partners in an LLC or in an S Corp. You have to rewrite your articles of incorporation, you have to file with the state, you have to get a lawyer involved. It takes a couple hours and a small chunk of money. It's not fluid. A for-profit corporation, as they get larger, they usually become for-profit corporations, become Chapter Cs. The advantage to a Chapter C is you can bring investors in and out at will. It's really easy. The disadvantage is they're taxed as a separate entity. So you get America's famous double taxation. Taxed as a corporation and taxed on the dividends that are paid to the members. A lot of people avoid that as they grow by being a nonprofit. A lot of open source projects choose the 503c nonprofit status to organize under. This is nice because you can solicit funds from anybody you want to, and you can provide services to anybody you want to, and you're not taxed at all. But you can't provide a financial dividend to anyone. You can't take more money than a certain operating cost for what you're providing. Now, a cooperative, and that has all the downsides of long-term revenue streams and some of those challenges. Now, the cooperative specific structures attempt to solve some of these problems. A widely used cooperative structure is the informal structure, where a group of people to get together and say, I have my business, you have your business, or I have my needs and you have your needs. They're similar. Let's work together. And everything's verbal. There's no written agreements. And you meet each other's needs and everybody feels good for having cooperated. The challenge of the informal structure is that it doesn't scale well. As lots of people get involved, communication gets expensive, it gets hard to manage expectations, and sooner or later someone gets mad. A lot of friendships are lost through informal cooperative structures. So there's what's called the subchapter T in tax code that defines a taxable cooperative. And there are nonprofit subchapter T cooperatives. This is nice. You can accept money from members, and you can provide revenue dividends back to those members, and you're not taxed as a corporation, as an entity. Everything is treated as a business expense by the members. So when the members put in money, they see that as a business expense. When they get a dividend back, they see that as a rebate on expenses. That's really nice. It works very cleanly. The downside is you can't provide services to anyone who's not a member. You have to be a member to be a subchapter T. Now, a for-profit cooperative, the idea here is that part of the cooperative is a for-profit organization. It provides services to non-members, and those non-members don't get dividends. And so at the end of the year, members could theoretically make more money than they contributed. And you're only taxed on that revenue that comes from the non-members. So everything that's bought or sold by members is treated as members' business expenses. Everything that's bought or sold by non-members is treated as a business expense. So the University of Wisconsin has a center of cooperatives that spends a lot of time talking about cooperatives and researching cooperative economics. And they put up this really helpful little chart that explains all the details related to these various forms of business organization. Yeah, really helpful. So I hope you understood all that. This is their excellent chart that helps you understand exactly what your tax bill is at the end of the year. You want to avoid the orange box, and you need to pay, because that's what you pay taxes on, and you like the green box, and you just follow the arrows, and you know what your tax bill is at the end of the year. So that was simple enough. Glad they provided it. So the point of these two slides is that one of the challenges of cooperative is that it's a little more complex than a traditional business. There's a little more overhead to manage some of these things, and that has a cost. But as that cost is spread across the members, it becomes manageable, and it's a benefit. It's not a sizable drawback. So what are the characteristics of a technology cooperative? They're consumer-owned. My proposal for technology cooperative is consumer-owned. It's a for-profit subchapter T that can provide services to anybody they want to, but focus on the needs of the members who are voting members. The goal is to make technology accessible to members. Open source is a really good way to do that. It's market-driven. It's not relying on handouts. It's sustainable. And it provides an excellent alignment for the production of floss software. Now, the nice thing about cooperatives is this isn't a fringe idea. Other people are doing this. I just think that it's an idea that doesn't receive the exposure it deserves. Cernio is one of these cooperatives. They're a shared services cooperative. They're mostly based in California. They do most of their business in California, but they're organized in Vancouver under Canadian cooperative law. It's a little friendlier than US law, according to some things I read. So Cernio's nice. They provide ISP services, co-location, VoIP, hosting, email, and they're mostly owned by members who run their own consulting firms using the infrastructure that Cernio provides. They claim 60 plus members. When I first came across them a couple years ago, they only had 30 plus members. So they appear to be growing, they appear to be active, and they really take a civic duty. They spend a lot of time talking about their philosophy of openness, about FLOSS software. You see some of those references on the page to philosophy. That their goal is to improve society and to make money doing it. Members are charged a one-time monthly fee, kind of like a credit union, and then they pay for the services that they're using within the organization. Another FLOSS-oriented cooperative is the Chicago Technology Group. They are mostly web designers and web developers. They target the nonprofit sector. They're a worker-owned cooperative. It's neat to see the way that they use cooperatives in their branding. They say, we're a cooperative. We're not investor-owned businesses. We don't fit into the greedy stereotype, and we understand you nonprofits uniquely. You should spend your money with us because we understand you and we're good guys just like you are. Being a cooperative has some advantages that way. It gives you warm, fuzzy feelings because the word cooperates in it. So, and like I said, they're focused on nonprofits. Probably the model that's closest to what Cooperate is proposing to do is the Southern Regional Education Board Technology Cooperative, or SREB. That's a nice acronym. Their members, aside from their members aren't consumers. Their members are state and local education departments. So they're a quasi-governmental agency. But you see, they take their open source part of their mission very seriously, and they spend a lot of time pushing open source into schools in the southeastern United States. They're identical in purpose to what Cooperate's proposing to do, but I think a direct-to-consumer model will better take advantage of market-driven economics. They're forced to really compete. And I think a direct-to-consumer model scales better. As it gets a certain size, it's not limited by which governments you've gotten on board, and you don't have to worry about the political scene of getting funding through the state legislature. You get to work much closer with your clients. So there's no cooperative that I'm aware of that follows exactly the model I'm advocating. But there are a lot of organizations that follow a cooperative model in technology and see that as a way to fund open source development. That's because there are some advantages to the cooperative model. The biggest, in case you hadn't noticed, is scale. The idea is there's no limit. The more people that you're serving, the more money you have to produce better solutions, and there's no reason to keep it proprietary. That is neat. As the cooperatives grow, they will likely split and federate, but that's much the way the open source projects currently split and federate as the needs of their communities fragment and they produce niche solutions, or as times change and the governance doesn't change. The cooperative model provides a nice framework that we can understand the process of forking and joining that happens among open source code bases currently. The cooperative model for open source development takes great advantage of network effects. So, question I'm frequently asked, what's in it for me? Traditionally, members of what would be a cooperative, they have to purchase from a company, which means sorting through all the scams. They have to hire a consultant, which means figuring out who's competent and who isn't. Or they have to do their work in-house, which means it's not their core competence, they're not a technology business, and it's a poor career path for the people that they're hiring in a lot of places, especially these smaller businesses. And that talent likes to leave. Those are the downsides traditionally. In a cooperative, they get a trusted vendor because they have a voice. They have a single point of contact they get to go to work with, and that vendor has a portal, a community around it that makes it easy to judge their competence. You go to the website and you can know if they're solving your solutions and if it's worth spending your money, getting a professional involved. You get to take advantage of bulk purchasing, which is important for smaller organizations. And you get a member dividend. You put all this together and you've got the lowest possible price that the market can provide for your service, or at least the lowest reasonable price that you can find. Now, technologists, there's something in it for them too. They get stability, they get a career, they get to be customer focused and don't have to respond to the demands of the investors, to demands of the investors that aren't in alignment with their customers and their users. They get to build and deploy open source software. They get to be freed from the burden of running a business. They get to spend time focused on doing cool, neato things for customers. That equals dream job. People say to me, so if you're not going to be the owner of the cooperative, why do you want to be involved? I say, I'm building my dream job. This is what I want to do. Now, what's in it for society? Society, though the exchange among private parties has some residual benefit for society, traditionally society is not a part of that communication, not a factor in that discussion. But in the cooperative model, what's good for society is a major factor. Ubuntu, I am because of who we are. There's fewer obstacles to sharing and cooperation. There's increased open source development. Life's good. People feel fuzzy at the end of the day knowing they did good today. That's a wonderful thing. It was interesting pitching this to various companies and various people. Some people got it, some people didn't. Oftentimes in an organization, the board would say, oh, that's awesome. You're providing me everything I need. I want to work with you. Let me get my current technology vendor on board. Oh, he doesn't like your idea because you want to replace him. Then we go to the technology vendors and they'd say, you're going to give me a career path. You're going to give me the opportunity to play with cool technologies. You're going to give me the opportunity to use tools that I can share at home too. That's great. Oh, I got to go find my board and get them involved with who you are and what I want to do with this. That finding an organization where both of those camps agreed, there were a few of them, but there weren't very many. And that's one of the big challenges. There are people who are very comfortable in their current jobs. We'll talk about that more in a moment. So what are the advantages of a technical cooperative? It's nice to get treated like a nonprofit. Investor-owned businesses, there's a certain stereotype. Not all businesses match it, but it's nice to be free of the stereotype. One gentleman said to me once, you're a cooperative? Oh, can I put you in touch with these people that I think are going to want to work with you? Another gentleman said to me once, oh, I thought you were a sales guy. I didn't realize you're talking about a cooperative. You can talk to me. It's nice to, even though in essence it's a sales pitch, it doesn't feel like a sales pitch because you're not coming in trying to take everything you can get. You're coming in trying to help them meet their own needs with a community that values them. You're the good guy. People like you. You're friendly. It's also nice to have an organization that's only taxed on profit from non-members. That lower tax burden can theoretically provide lower costs. It can be, especially as it grows, that can be very substantial. You get explicit rules to govern the cooperation that encourage fairness. And because cooperatives have been around a while, there's models you can draw from that aren't all technical, aren't all open source oriented. There are groups that have tried this in various ways and learned pros and cons, and you can learn from how they're doing work. One of my favorite examples is formal consensus. It's an idea of how you can encourage democratic decision-making, direct participatory decision-making, and still come with resolutions quick enough that you stay competitive. And it's neat to see that people have thought about this and deployed some of these models. And of course, as we talked about, you get economies of scale. Now there's some obstacles. We talked about the legal costs. The founding members pay a little more than everyone else because you got to have that startup legal cost. And there's limited legal and accounting expertise in this area. As I called around trying to find a lawyer to work with, the first 9 of them said, cooperative? You mean an LLC, right? No. You mean a partnership, right? No. I mean a cooperative. Oh, so what kind of farm do you own? What kind of farm are you? No, it's a technical cooperative. We want to help people use that model to solve their technical needs. I made a lot of calls. Unfortunately, the challenge is it varies state by state as well. So you can't find, in Wisconsin, the Center Cooperatives can point me at all sorts of Wisconsin lawyers, but not many of them understood Utah. So there was one that did. Stoll Rives is a national firm, and they have an attorney who understood Utah cooperative law. But I also found Randon Wilson of Jones Waldo knew his stuff, or at least appeared to, and we had some really good conversations. He provided a lot of excellent advice. But because there's a limited supply in this area, it can be a little more expensive. And because you want a lot of fair communication among members, that requires a professional's time to create bylaws and figure out governance and to build these rules. It gets a little expensive. And we're not talking insane costs. My estimate from the vendors I talked to is we could get the whole thing off the ground for $10,000. So our membership fee, we're looking at between $1,000 and $2,000 a member for a year. We figure we get 5-10 members involved. we're off the ground. We're about halfway there when we decided it wasn't going to work this year. But that additional overhead of the startup does make a difference. A lot of people said, oh, once you're off the ground, I'd be happy to be involved. And the entrenched interests is one of the challenges as well. People are very comfortable doing what they're doing. And some of those people don't like change. Others of those people understand that what they're providing is suboptimal, and they don't really want you to mess up their gig. Surprising number of people were interested, though. We're interested in joining Cooperative as a technologist as well as an organization. Now, this idea usually takes a minute to process. It's a little out of the ordinary for the way most of us are trained to think about business. And so consumers don't usually appreciate that value of ownership. We need outside catalysts to help spread the meme. And that lack of mind share is one of the big challenges. It takes a couple conversations and a little bit of pondering before most people can see what's in it for them, which is one of the challenges. And there's a lot of skepticism. People either don't believe that you're interested, that you're really interested, keep asking, where's the scam? Where are you going to walk away with $1 million in this? Well, probably won't, but I get a dream job out of it. Then the next question, but you think you can really do this? They either don't understand why you're interested, or they don't think you can pull it off. And that's part of that confidence. Nobody wants to be the first in the pool. Once you've got a track record, it's really easy to sell the idea. Getting that track record, you got to find some people who can see the larger benefit for their organization as well as for society. But really what put the nail in the coffin this year was the current economic uncertainty. The schools I was working with had their budget slashed 10% retroactively and an additional 10% for the 2009-2010 school year. So the people I was working with were very interested to say, hey, we love this idea. Come back to us next summer. We'll look at it again. So that gives us a little bit more time to build that community, to build that membership. Now, this isn't an education-specific idea, I hope you see. It's just the area I chose to implement it. But you can see this working for small and medium businesses. You can see this working for specific type, realtors that might be interested in a floss-specific solution. You can see this working in a lot of industries. So as you go back and return to your organizations and deal with a lot of the difficulties of being the sole technology provider in a small and medium business and working with vendors that you don't know if you trust and whose interests aren't aligned with yours, think about this idea. Talk with other people. We'll see again if we can't get this off the ground. So I appreciate your time, and we'll give a little bit of time for questions. Yes, sir.
How would you deal, so say you were going to create like a cooperative of like nonprofits or something, or an IT-related type organization. How would you deal with different size, scale of the members?
Mm-hmm.
I know you talk about no first class or second class citizens, but how do you deal with different needs, both in terms of time from the cooperative? How would you deal with that? Would you do like a base rate plus like service charges? Or is that what you're sort of...
So the way that's solved by existing cooperatives, and it can be a real challenge, and there's two challenges there. The first is, how do you make sure that people have a voice in the cooperative where the big guys don't drown out everyone else? And the answer to that is that's the way the bylaws get written. That's why a lawyer's involved. And some cooperatives, the founding members, they don't mind if the big guy has a little more voice. Other cooperatives want to make sure it's one organization, one voice. And some cooperatives think that's the right way to do it. But I think you can be more pragmatic than that. The second question, though, is how do you provide services so that the little guy gets attention as well as the big guy? The nice thing about that question is that's a typical technology company question. How do you make sure your big customers' needs and your small customers' needs balance each other out? And that's a hard balancing act, but it's one that every organization does today. So an IT cooperative is managed just like a business. Everybody pays for the services as they use it, and the service and the money they pay for has to cover the cost of those services. It's got to be sustainable revenue. And then at the end of the year, the money's paid back as a percentage of what you spend. So the big guy gets a bigger share, they spend more. The smaller companies get a smaller share, they spend less. But everybody's paying their own way, and everybody's getting the resources of the larger cooperative. That adequately answer your question? Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Well, okay, I think I get the idea of the cooperative for services, but I don't understand how this word open source plugs into that.
So the fundamental background to, my fundamental reasoning to go down this road is, as an open source developer, how do I make sure I get paid? And the question is, the reality in the software business is that usually the person that's paying me is an investor who wants a really big return. In a cooperative, the investor is the customer. They don't want a big return, they want the cheapest possible solution. And so I have a lot of incentive as a developer. There's no boss coming down my back saying, patent, 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 lock up, lock up, lock up. You know, don't use an open standard, we want vendor lock-in. Instead, as a developer, my customer's saying, you can get that off the shelf, you can go harness this open source code and adapt it to my needs, you can polish up this open source project and provide the documentation I'm missing. Yeah, that's what I want you to do, because that's the cheaper solution for me. So that alignment leads into open source development in a much better way than a traditional investor-owned business. Yes, sir.
So, and I think this is kind of feeding off what he just said. All the examples you gave of cooperatives, they're mostly consuming open source. They're not really producing a ton of open source software. So they're taking open source and they're building service businesses off of this open source, produced. They're not, there's no cooperative that I can see, or that you gave an example, that is actually producing a widely adopted open source project, unless you can give me an example.
So there is no cooperative that's producing a single widely adopted open source project that I'm aware of. But the nice thing about open source is that the consumers of open source are usually the producers of open source. It maybe not of the additional idea and the core technology, but of the bug reports, of the testing, of patches and fixes, additional, that ecosystem that's often lacking in the open source world around the code that gets distributed. Now, CERN, they're very proud of their open source contributions, and they have a list of who they've donated to and what places they've done. Matter of fact, we can go back. One of the nice things about the Chicago Technology Group is they are one of the core contributors to Drupal. They say, we are web developers, we're a cooperative, and we contribute to Drupal, and that's how we lower your costs. Now, the Southern Regional Educational Board, their goal is to produce open source solutions for their schools that are specific to what their schools need. So they have a testing platform, they have a gradebook plugin that the schools can use for some of the things they're doing. So it's probably not widely adopted because they are a niche cooperative, but they're producing open source code because that's the cheapest way to solve their members' problems. Yes, sir, in the back.
So what are the customers paying for? I mean, I write this app to open source. What are they paying me to do? I mean, are they buying the source code from me? Are they paying me by the hour? Or how do I make money on what I'm doing?
So there's different models to make that work. And I left that intentionally vague because I think there's different solutions to that problem. And until somebody starts getting some of these off the ground, I think we're going to see a variety. What we were using as Cooperate is people are paying for IT services more than custom development. So we worked it as a consultancy. You pay per engineering hour. If you want an off-the-shelf, if you want a plugin to OpenOffice to solve this grading need, then you'd pay us as an engineer a couple hours time to solve that problem. And you'd also pay with, for your hosting service or for the telephony we're providing, and any bug fixes or support or documentation we have to provide to that. But the nice thing about Cooperative is you can charge an annual membership fee that pays into a lot of these core projects. So say for you to be a voting member of the cooperative, your organization has to pay $5,000 a year. My market research says that wasn't an excessive amount to ask. And what do you get for that? You get to pick what project an engineer is going to work on. Maybe that's in your bylaws. Or you get to pick what project or where you want you get a vote in how the cooperative spends its engineering resources, even though they're freely distributed later. And that annual membership fee pays for those consumable services. So there are various models that'll work, and I think that the price structure is low enough that as something scales, it'll make a lot of sense. But in the short term, you won't be doing a lot of open source development, fresh, groundbreaking technology. That's something that has to come down the road as you get off the ground. Yes, sir.
In your Cooperative model, then, is it just your intention that the bylaws would at least assume that what is produced open source wise can be given back to the open source community as a kind of a side effect of providing service to your membership?
So the nice thing about a cooperative is that the members, those founding members that are putting up the capital, they get a voice, and a strong voice. So my goal over the past year is to find people who are interested in forming an organization like this that have some of the same leanings as I do, so that we can get a phrase like that stuck in the bylaws. You know, as a developer, I'm building my dream job. What do I want to do? I want to build free and open source software. And you know, places like the Chicago Technology Group and Cernio, they have in their bylaws, all the intellectual property we produce needs to be owned by the larger community. And I think that's a good model for explaining to people how you're going to lower their prices. Yes, sir.
There seems to me there's a bit of a contradiction in some of the advantages that you say and then this reality where you're talking about it didn't really work out because the economics right now. If you really had these advantages and you could provide these things at a much lower cost, then that should be, like it should be counter-cyclical. You should be able to take advantage of that economics and it shouldn't be a disadvantage. So how do you kind of in your own like mental model of this reconcile that?
And I think you're exactly right that it should be counter-cyclical. The big challenge is that startup cost, that initial chunk of money that somebody has to come up with to get started. But I think the bigger problem, I think an open source cooperative, based on the research and pitching the idea and trying to implement some of these solutions, it will provide lower costs. But it's that meme, getting people to understand what this model is and be involved enough. You have to start with more than one group. You have to start with 3, 4, 5 different organizations that are interested in collaborating, because there's no collaboration among one organization. So,
I guess if you can't make that argument more effectively when the economy's bad, what makes you think that you're going to be able to do that when the economy's good?
Well, and I agree. And I think we can make that argument effectively when the economy's bad. The key point in making the argument, though, is to point out that I've only been pitching this since March. And I really only pitched it for 3 months. So it's a new idea. I like this forum because it's an opportunity to spread it among more people. And I think given time and traction, people will see that benefit, and it will, I think that argument does make sense, and I agree it is counter-cyclical. But it takes time to process that. You got to build the marketing docs, you got to help people understand the cost-benefit ratio. We still have a lot of questions about how we want to do bylaws and governance. Now, those are challenges to getting off the ground, independent of what the cost will be. So, well, looks like I'm out of time. So I appreciate everybody's attention and time. Feel free to ask me if you have any questions.